You do not have a First Amendment right against a private employer unless you can show that the government has coerced that private employer to censor you in one particular
Which
way.
we'll get to.
We will get to that.
Anytime the government pressures private employers to punish speech that the government doesn't approve of, I think there's certainly that raises the question of a First Amendment violation.
Welcome on into another Tying It Together with Tim Boyum. I am Tim Boyum here with producer John McHugh. And John, after Charlie Kirk and all Jimmy Kimmel and everything going on, there's a lot of outrage out there. But I wanted to get down to the kind of the heart of what we do as journalists in the issue in the First Amendment. And I'm kind of surprised in some ways how much this has become a huge thing out there and a huge disagreement, I guess. It's a difficult thing to talk about.
It is, and it's something that I think a lot of the disagreement comes from some fundamental misunderstandings on both sides, on every side, even apolitically. I think, people think they have this idea of what free speech is, and doesn't usually line up with the reality of it. Yeah,
and it's hard. We've had conversations about how to cover this stuff because there's a lot of outrage out there. There's a lot of, I'm on this side, you're on that side. There's been a problem, and I think today is a good solution to that. We got a couple law professors on, friends of our program. Mm-hmm. We even get into the history of it a little bit. I hope people can learn a lot because there are a lot of misunderstandings. So
yeah, it's as educational as it is, a model for what these debates can be, and maybe you could say should be. But yeah, I mean, we go to these guys all the time. They're great. They always break things down in very easier to understand than some legal theories and ideas are. So yeah, it's a great conversation.
Yep, and they agree on a lot. They have great concerns though too, so it's just fascinating. All right, so our guests are Greg Wallace. He's with Campbell School of Law, teaches constitutional law with an emphasis on religious freedom, Second Amendment, and free speech. He's got degrees from Virginia, a law degree from the University of Arkansas Little Rock, and has been celebrating 30 years at Campbell Law School. Bill Marshall has spent 24 years at the UNC School of Law, research focus on the First Amendment, law degree from University of Chicago, and undergrad from Penn. He was once a deputy counsel at the White House under Bill Clinton. Great conversation. Let's get right to it. I thought I'd start by reading the First Amendment for our viewers. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances. It's an oldie but a goodie, right?
It certainly is.
What should we know, do you think, that people aren't reminded of about the history of that and the origins of that?
Well, what's interesting is that we don't have a lot of contemporaneous historical material about the meaning of the free speech clause, like we do, for example, the religion clause. That was debated in Congress, lots of different versions. We don't know much about the background of the free speech clause, except that there were those at the time who believed that that speech was free to the extent that the government couldn't stop you from saying it initially, but they could punish you afterwards.
What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, Greg's absolutely right. There's not much history behind it, and it's interesting that the Supreme Court, while it's looking at original intent in other areas, really doesn't look at that so much with respect to the speech clause. A lot of it was would seem to be historically aimed at the process of licensing that occurred in England, that in order to publish something, it had to be approved by the Crown. First Amendment seemed to be going towards that. But other than that, it's fairly ambiguous as to what the initial purposes were.
So the punishing after that you mentioned, does that leave the door open then to a response from the government?
Well, under that view of free speech, which I think is a narrow view dealing only with what we would call prior restraints on speech, Yeah, it does. But I don't think that's historically how our American constitutional protection for free speech has been understood. We have taken a broader view of that would also prohibit the government in most cases from punishing speech after it's uttered.
What do we, well, obviously you guys know a lot, but what about sort of challenges to this or how it's been interpreted over history?
Well, it's been interpreted extraordinarily broadly. We protect more speech in the United States than I'm pretty sure almost any country does. We protect speech that is very provocative. We protect speech that's very sexually explicit. We even put commercial speech and advertising into the First Amendment equation. Although it can be limited to some degree, it still has some measure of constitutional protection. So I think most people don't realize how broad that protection is. I think the biggest mistake that people make with respect to the speech clause is that they believe it applies to private speech generally. So that they believe that when somebody tells somebody in the NFL that they can't engage in a certain kind of protest, that player has a First Amendment right. They don't. You do not have a First Amendment right against a private employer unless you can show that the government has coerced that private employer to censor you in one particular
Which we'll
way.
get to.
We will get to that.
What about challenges over time? Have there been many?
Well, Bill's exactly right, and this is a very important point, I think, for people to understand. I remember when the Dixie Chicks back in the early 2000s went overseas and criticized President Bush and the American government, that they came back and their country music fans were outraged by it, and they stopped buying Dixie Chicks music. And Natalie Maines went on TV and said, "Well, they're violating our free speech rights." No, actually, the people who were refusing to buy their music, who were boycotting them, were exercising their own free speech rights in that way. The First Amendment typically does not apply to private versus private free speech. That's why I can tell my kids, growing up at my house, there's no free speech rights to talk back to their parents.
There's one judge, one constitution. Have there been very many court cases? I mean, obviously there's been a ton, but any that have sort of evolved how, like, the Supreme Court views the First Amendment over time?
Oh, sure. I mean, the First Amendment wasn't initially that well protected. The big cases took place around World War I. And actually, in most of those cases, the court upheld the restriction upon people protesting the war, protesting labor conditions. But in those cases, Justices Brandeis and Holmes wrote some dissents that have since become the law of the land, are very protective. It was during that period, for example, that Justice Holmes came out with the metaphor of the marketplace of ideas, that we should let everything come into the First Amendment marketplace and truth will win out eventually over whatever falsity is there.
What do you think the founders would think about the debate today?
I think they would be largely in favor of the broader interpretation of the free speech clause by the Supreme Court. But as Bill said, that's come fairly late in the game here, just in the 20th, 21st centuries here. It was the test that the Supreme Court employed back in the early 20th century, the clear and present danger test, for example, was very vague. It could be twisted and used by juries to suppress speech that the government did not find favorable.
People say, there was a famous one, you can't yell fire in a movie theater. Is that specifically from a case?
Yeah, that is. That's Justice Holmes.
From that time period?
From that time period, at a period when he was less speech protective than he later became. But that's where that metaphor comes from.
Wow, that's interesting. All right, so let's get to what we've seen in recent weeks. Obviously, Jimmy Kimmel, being suspended and everything that's come out from there. So let's start with that. The people are saying, obviously, that they think that the FCC chairman, for instance, saying we can do this the easy way or the hard way. And then Jimmy Kimmel is suspended. What do we think about that? Is that the government going too far or no?
Well, I do think to the extent that the government is putting pressure on private employers, private social media companies, as the Biden administration did, according to the lower court findings in the Murthy versus Missouri case. Anytime the government pressures private employers to punish speech that the government doesn't approve of, I think there's certainly that raises the question of a First Amendment violation. With Jimmy Kimmel, I'm not sure that's what happened. I think that, from what I've read, was much more of a market decision. You had ABC affiliates refusing to carry his show because of some of the crass comments that he had made, and the show was already losing money. So I don't know that the government had the heavy hand in this particular case. If it did, though, I think it would be a First Amendment problem.
I'm guessing you see.
Yeah,
1 plus 2 equals 3 more here.
Yeah, I mean, it happens right after the threatening of you can do this the easy way or you can do it the hard way. And it seems to me that they put an awful lot of pressure on ABC. And again, to go back what we said before, if ABC wanted to fire Kimmel, they're free to do that. It's the question of when the government puts too much pressure on. And the threat that took place in that case by the FCC chair is a lot stronger than anything the Biden administration did. And as Greg pointed out, at least Justice Alito was very concerned about what the Biden administration did. What the Biden administration did, by the way, was try to pressure social media not to cover statements that they felt were false regarding the health threat of COVID primarily. And that was challenged on the basis that the government was overly pressuring the social media companies, which are private companies, and that was what triggered the freedom of speech claim.
You were chuckling.
No, the Biden administration, I mean, if you look at the factual findings in the district court there, by the way, the Supreme Court did not reach the merits of that decision. It rejected the case on standing grounds, which is not a merits type of decision. But that was something that was repeated. It was pervasive. It was frequent, not just a single instance. But in the end, that really doesn't matter. I think Bill and I both agree that if the government is unduly pressuring private entities to punish people because of their speech, whether it's against the government or whatever kinds of topics, then I think that raises some serious First Amendment questions. We don't want the government doing that.
If there's a lawsuit, Jimmy Kimmel brings this up, does he have to prove that there's emails between FCC Chairman Carr and ABC, or no? Because it was public what he said there.
It was public what he said. I think these things are.
But there is evidence that ratings were down, he's losing money, et cetera.
Yeah, and they may make that defense, but it's going to be a factual inquiry, and we can disagree about what the facts look like. We can disagree about how coercive something is. The Biden administration tried to persuade they didn't threaten sanctions, for example. Here was a complete threatening of sanctions. Now, the causation may be hard to show, may be easy to show, but the statement made by the FCC chair was pretty blatant.
The one other interesting point was the Pentagon officials promising to address federal employees who mock or celebrate Kirk's death. Now, those are federal employees, so how does that work?
This is pretty technical. Unlike a private...
I'm glad you're explaining this.
Unlike a private employee who doesn't have a First Amendment right against their employer, federal and state government employees do have a First Amendment right. So I have a First Amendment right against the University of North Carolina. Greg doesn't have a First Amendment right against Campbell. I am free to say things, but I can be sanctioned under certain circumstances. First of all, what I have to talk about has to be a matter of public concern. And second of all, it has to not be disruptive to my job in one way or form. That latter one is a little squishier than just the question of public concern.
Depends on what you do.
Depends on what I do. If what I'm doing and saying something cuts the efficiency or cuts the integrity of my job, then maybe they can sanction me. But if it's just a matter of public concern, if I'm out there saying, vote for candidate X or something like that, or if I'm criticizing what's occurred, or commenting on a major event, generally that's going to be protected. And I think the thumb is on the scale to protect the speech of public employees unless they can really show it's not a matter of public concern and it truly is disruptive.
Is that the way you see it too?
Yes, I would agree with that. Even though I work for a private university, we do have our grant of academic freedom that's in our university's handbooks, and even I think the ABA now is requiring law schools to have free speech policies that reflect the First Amendment standards, even for private law schools to be accredited. So we just got through last year. I helped draft, and we got approved by our faculty a free speech policy for Campbell University Law School. But Bill's right about the employee aspect of it.
So it'll really depend. If it happens, it'll really depend on what they're doing for a living.
Yeah.
One of the other interesting ones is Attorney General Pam Bondi, that she said there's free speech and then there's hate speech. We'll absolutely target you, go after you if you're targeting anyone with hate speech. She walked that back some.
Yeah, what most people don't understand, and this has really been more before General Bondi said this. It's really been more of a outcry on the left, the political left, that hate speech is not protected speech. But actually, the Supreme Court repeatedly has said that hate speech is protected speech. And one of the main reasons is, how do you define hate speech? I would be fine if hate speech wasn't protected, so long as I could be the one that defines what hate speech is. You know, that's it's a very hard thing, and we don't want some government bureaucrat saying, well, this is hateful, and then punishing people because of that. So her initial effort, I think, was kind of clumsy and not accurate. Now, she did walk that back and said, well, hate speech that triggers some sort of riot or advocates or incites to immediate lawless action. Those are that would apply to any kind of speech, not just hate speech, even if it's not hate speech. But there are certain categories of speech the Supreme Court has said that are not protected under the First Amendment. Incitement to imminent lawless action is one. Incitement to riot is another. So when you close that connection between speech and violence, the less likely that speech is going to be protected under the Constitution.
Yeah, one of the interesting things that I think Greg alluded to is how people flip on this. And Nat Hentoff wrote a book called Free Speech for Me, but Not for Thee. Everybody thinks their speech is protected, but when it's something that they really don't like, and this is coming from the left and it's coming from the right, all of a sudden they're willing to abandon free speech protections.
Yeah. Are you surprised? I mean, we've had periods of unrest in this country. I mean, everyone thinks we're a victim of recency bias, right? Like, this is the worst time in American history, whatever. We've been through quite a bit before. I mean, has this been a discussion point in other periods? You mentioned after World War I, but has it always been sort of like this periodically?
During the communist scare in the 50s in particular, there was a lot of action against public employees. There was a lot of action against private employees with any sort of notion that there was any kind of association with communism or leftism. And there was a tremendous amount of censorship that took place, a tremendous amount of requiring loyalty oaths. It was a very, very sad period for the First Amendment during that period.
President Trump suggested revoking licenses if they give him too much bad publicity.
And he also brought this $15 billion suit against the New York Times. And I don't know where that's coming from, because it doesn't seem to violate the normal defamation standards. I mean, I think President Trump is somebody who's a free speech for me but not for thee kind of person, and I think we're seeing that play out.
What do you think?
I'm not sure I'd go that far. I think that he has won. They've settled some lawsuits for defamation in the past with him. Other media outlets have, and so I think I think one thing about President Trump is that he's somebody that will fight back if and stand up to his critics, and that's something that we probably all ought to admire more. But you don't want the government in the business of suppressing people's speech. One area that I have been somewhat concerned about is the questions about anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitic comments are despicable, horrible. People shouldn't make those kinds of comments. But there is a difference between the sort of marketplace of ideas taking care of those comments and the government stepping in and punishing people for speech. Now, to be sure, the government can punish people for conduct. And so riotous conduct, defacing property, imprisoning people during riots, these kinds of things that have all been associated with some of these anti-Semitic riots are clearly actionable. They're clearly illegal, and people can be arrested or sued for those kinds of things. But speech alone is protected, and I think that's and as Bill said, a lot of times these are really sort of fact-intensive types of cases. Where do you draw that line between the speech and the conduct? And that depends on the facts in each case.
One other thing, just one last thing about something specific. Matt Mercer, who's the spokesman for the North Carolina Republican Party, said, "Free speech does not entitle someone to have a show air on a national network and be paid millions of dollars for the privilege. You're welcome for this final lesson on Constitution Day."
He's dead wrong. That's just wrong. I think Greg's going to agree with me on that.
Which leads me to my question, I guess. There's all these social media interpretations of free speech. How much does social media, do you think, play a role in how we're going to evolve on this issue and what we think about it and how we listen to other people? Does it make you nervous?
It makes me nervous. And when you ask the question about the framers, I wonder how they would react to social media, because social media is unfiltered. And I think the framers sort of believed that speech would be filtered in some way or another. You have to say it to somebody, or you have to say it in a way that's accountable. Now, true that they did protect anonymous speech at times, but not to the degree that we have now. And what social media, I think, encourages is really irresponsible and unaccountable speech.
I agree.
And that, I think, has corrupted the marketplace of ideas in a way that we wouldn't have seen it otherwise.
So, go ahead.
You know, the very nature of social media lends itself to assertion without argument. And I think that people are able to sit behind their phones or their computer screens at some far off place where, as in the past, if they actually said that face to face to somebody might punch them out because of saying that. So there is no longer the sort of incentive of being polite and not necessarily engaging in this kind of unfiltered sort of speech. How to deal with the issue of social media is a tough one because, see, all the social media companies are private entities. So when the government tries to regulate the social media companies, as some of the states have, then I think there's a viable free speech question there as to whether, in the interest of trying to regulate the social media companies' control over private speech, the government actually is entering itself into a regulation of speech.
There's not much you can do on that, right? You either got to pass another amendment or find a Supreme Court that's willing to narrow it down, right?
Yeah, it's pretty much right. I mean, you asked one earlier about misunderstandings about the First Amendment, and one is, I think, just because you have a First Amendment right to say something doesn't mean you're a good person when you say it. Doesn't mean you're being responsible when you say it. I mean, a lot of the people who won First Amendment cases are not people you really want to hang out with. Those include pornographic bookstores. It includes people protesting funerals of people who've died in military service.
And the Nazis at Skokie.
The Nazis at Skokie, exactly. And I do think that saying that what I did and what I said was protected by the First Amendment is not a response to whether you were responsible in saying that.
It's global, too, social media. Some of these companies are owned by foreign companies, people that are on them and trying to infiltrate this country. How does that? There's not much you can do, right? It's kind of a wild west.
Well, there's not much you can do as a direct regulation of how social media companies regulate their speech. You might remove the legal protections for libel, slander, those kinds of things that they have under current law, but I think those have to be addressed more on a sort of a monopoly type of issue. I think the real problem I see with the social media companies is that they have so much power that it's very hard to get alternative media companies into the mix. And I think that's because they've sort of monopolized the marketplace, if you will.
We are in an era, though, where this is separate, but where the courts are very politicized, and people are picking people for reasons of whether it's a justice or, a state Supreme Court or a local court. Could we get to the point, though, where it all gets to one part or the other, no matter what party it is, and we see a court ruling that could change the First Amendment?
It's possible. I mean, I do think that there are some on the court right now who want to make it easier to win a defamation suit, and they've said that in some of their opinions, and that could change an awful lot with respect to the First Amendment rights in particular. So yeah, I think that's possible. I think some of the members of the court have indicated that they want morality to come more into the ability of government to censor speech than we have seen previously. I mean, that's across party lines. Actually, this isn't a Republican-Democrat issue as much as it is just other kinds of views. So it's unclear.
An issue of power.
An issue of power.
It's an issue of control. That's right. And I mean, if there's anything we know historically is that government does not like speech that is critical of government.
That's right.
And that's why we have a free speech clause.
It's the brilliance of
that's
it, right?
Exactly. I mean we don't want the government coming down on people when they criticize it, and that's whatever road leads us to that result is a road we need to stay off of.
Because you're more critical of it, do you believe that's under threat now, though?
Do I believe that free speech is under threat? Oh yeah, I think it's under threat from multiple sources, multiple directions. I think the changing nature of technology it makes it under threat because of the problems we've talked about before. People are looking for solutions to that. If they enact some of those solutions, they're likely to infringe upon traditional First Amendment doctrine. And if First Amendment doctrine changes to challenge those kinds of speech, it might have effects that challenges more traditional kinds of speech. So yeah, I do think the First Amendment is possibly on the brink of major changes
Through the Supreme Court.
through the Supreme Court.
Do you agree?
Yeah, I think Bill and I would probably disagree about what particular threats are out there. But I certainly agree with Bill that this is a minefield. I mean, it's very hard to be stepping through the free speech conundrum without landing on a mine, and I think we have to be very careful. Probably the one thing that I sort of fall back on is that, when in doubt, I think, or when, if we're going to err, let's err on the side of free speech, not on the side of government control. And I think that's probably as we move through this. That doesn't mean that mistakes aren't going to be made, that you might get some bad court decisions on this, but in the end, we have to protect free speech. Otherwise, we won't have it for very long.
What is it like with your students right now? I'm just thinking because the younger generation, all your students have grown up in at least a highly internet era, many of them social media. What's the conversation been like?
Sensitive, to say the least. I think my students, like the public at large, have a strong belief in freedom of speech when they agree with that speech, and they are less sympathetic to freedom of speech when they do not agree with that speech. And that's why you need, this is where Greg and I completely agree. That's why you need a speech clause, because when government's in power, the people who support that government have a tendency to not support freedom of speech, and when they're out of power, they have a tendency to want a stronger protection of freedom of speech. And the brilliance of the First Amendment is it protects those out of power, and I think that's critically important.
That's also why it's brilliant in some ways to make it hard to overturn amendments, right?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
It takes a lot of work and agreement to make something change like that, I would think.
Yeah.
It's just fascinating. All right, anything else you guys want to talk about we didn't cover?
I don't think we solved everything today, Tim, but
The one thing I did want to bring back, though, you mentioned the era of communism and that. We got through that, right? Mm-hmm. Is there a way to look at it, that how bad that was, that we got through it, that we'll get through this too?
we did get through it, but a lot of people's lives were destroyed.
That's right.
A lot of people's lives were destroyed. I mean, the effort to weed out people in the entertainment industry, in government,
Blacklisting.
These are people with really good reputations and who had an awful lot of creativity and a lot of contributions to the society. So when you start going after people who you don't like what they're doing politically, you might get over it, but there's damage while it's actually occurring.
So if that keeps happening, and this is a little less deliberate by the government, but these threats coming from the FCC and in some instances the president, are lawsuits coming out?
Yes.
Yeah. I would. I think the difference that I see between the communist blacklisting and that era back then is that was focused on one particular issue. Are you a communist or are you not? That kind of thing. What I see with not just my students, but with interactions publicly, social media, things like this, is I see that people today are, about all things, are just less filtered, less restrained, less willing to say something that is impolite or vile or intemperate, and it's almost as if we just are losing our filters as society, and I think that's a real concern, because it's like when you have crime and disorder rise in a society, history has shown that people are much more willing to take government controls to ensure their safety, from on a criminal standpoint. And I think that the extent to which it's perceived that people's speech is out of control. And I think frankly we've seen with some of the responses to the Charlie Kirk assassination have just been disheartening about how mean-spirited people are. And I think when that's perceived, then I think you have a populace. You wind up with a populace that might be more willing for government controls of speech. And I don't think that's a good idea. That's the problem, and that's the threat that I'm concerned about as well.
I would just, as a citizen, desensitized. How we can, people see Charlie Kirk murdered on social media or watching it. I mean, I know so many people that watched it. There's like the car wreck; they couldn't turn away from it and watch it. Like that is a very concerning thing about society, and it becomes easier for people to do these things. You used to blame video games for things and that, but it is the desensitizing of things is kind of scary in some ways. All right. Well, sorry we didn't solve it.
Next time.
Next time. Well, we have one next week again. you got a week. Guys, good to see you. Thank you.
Thank you.
If you want to keep up with what's happening in North Carolina politics and hear more conversations with people shaping our state and beyond, subscribe to our channel. Let Spectrum News be your resource for balanced, in-depth political coverage, elections, and issues that matter to you.